A university professor with 2 doctorates, a man who had read more books than most of us will in a lifetime, walked into a gastroenterology clinic, and the doctor asked him one question: "What does your poop look like?" He had no idea. He had never once looked.
Wow. That's not ignorance, that's a cultural blind spot.
Welcome to Deep Into the Pages. Today, we're opening up a conversation that a shocking percentage of us desperately need to have, but almost no one is willing to start.
Right, because it's so taboo.
Exactly. We're looking at a foundational text for our biology today called "You've Been Pooping All Wrong" by Dr. Trisha Pasricha. It's a brisk 256 pages from Avery, but I mean, what's packed inside is going to completely dismantle everything you thought you knew about your own body.
And our mission for you today is highly specific. If you're tuning in right now, you are about to discover why something as fundamental as, universal as this basic bodily function remains a completely silent source of suffering for roughly 40% of adults.
40%, that's a massive number.
It is. We're going to examine exactly how the modern medical system, and really our culture at large, has completely failed to teach us our own basic mechanical engineering.
It really is staggering when you lay it out like that. I mean, we should go back to Dr. Pasricha's first week seeing patients in her gastroenterology clinic, because that professor's story perfectly frames the scope of the problem.
Yeah, she goes into her practice with what seems like a bulletproof assumption, right?
Right.
That adult patients, functioning, successful, tax-paying adults, would possess a baseline understanding of their own bodily output.
You'd think that's the absolute minimum telemetry of the human machine, just, basic data.
Exactly. The consistency, the color, the baseline physical effort required.
Mm.
But patient after patient sits down in her office and reveals a level of functional illiteracy that defies logic.
And the professor with the 2 doctorates is like the ultimate emblem of this paradox. Here is a man who has mapped out incredibly complex intellectual terrain over a 40-year career.
Right. He understands abstract theoretical frameworks. He navigates university politics. He dissects dense literature.
But the daily physical output of his own biological engine, he has literally never glanced into the toilet bowl. It never even crossed his mind that there was vital, actionable data sitting there.
Which is just wild. But the book details other case studies that push this beyond just a quirky anecdote into actual heartbreaking physical damage.
Yeah, the athlete story. That one really got me.
Consider the story of the elite college athlete she treats. We are talking about someone whose entire existence is predicated on bodily optimization.
Right. This athlete understands kinesthetic awareness, fast-twitch muscle fibers, VO2 max, all these complex biomechanics.
Yet for years, the same athlete had been sitting in the bathroom genuinely convinced that straining, bearing down with maximum effort, holding their breath, turning red in the face, was simply the definition of successfully pushing.
They thought that was just how it worked.
Yeah. That is the Valsalva maneuver in action. They are creating massive intra-abdominal pressure by forcing air against a closed airway.
Which, in weightlifting, that stabilizes your spine during a heavy squat.
Exactly. But in the bathroom, it completely sabotages the evacuation process. It goes against every single biological imperative the body has for that moment.
But the athlete didn't know any better. Because the sports world, which tracks every single macro and micronutrient, I mean, they measure everything, treats the actual elimination of waste as a taboo subject.
And the cost of that silence is incredibly steep. There's another case in the book, the tech executive.
Oh man, this one hits incredibly close to home.
Right. Given how normalized this behavior is in corporate environments, here's a guy managing high-stakes portfolios, dealing with back-to-back meetings, crushing inbox demands.
He's just grinding all day.
Right. And his body would initiate the gastrocolic reflex, which is the natural biological cue to empty the colon, usually triggered after eating, but he was, quote, too busy.
So he just clamped down.
He clamped down. He actively suppressed his own autonomic nervous system, holding his bowel movements in for 12-hour workdays.
We really have to look at the cellular reality of what he was doing there.
Yeah.
Because when you suppress that urge, the rectal vault stretches to accommodate the material.
Yeah, and the mechanoreceptors in the tissue eventually adapt to that stretch. They just stop sending the signal to the brain.
The body essentially says, well, message ignored, shutting off the alarm.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the material just sits there in the colon, which is basically a giant water reabsorption organ.
For hour after hour, the colon is just sucking the moisture out of the stool.
Yeah. By the time this executive finally went home and allowed himself to try, the material was practically fossilized.
Wow.
He did this for years until his system completely short-circuited. He literally collapsed on the tile floor of his own bathroom from the sheer vagal nerve shock of trying to pass what he had created.
Those stories just pack such a profound emotional punch. I mean, these are highly competent, hyper-successful individuals who optimize everything else in their lives.
But in this one foundational domain, they are operating entirely in the dark.
And we really have to ask why. It is obviously not a lack of intelligence. It's a deliberate, active, cultural decision.
It really is.
As a society, we celebrate potty training a toddler as this massive, triumphant developmental milestone, right? We buy the picture books, we give them stickers, we throw a literal parade in the living room when they succeed.
Yeah, the potty parade.
Right. And then we make this collective, silent pact to never, ever discuss bodily mechanics again. We just coast on the assumption that a 2-year-old's understanding of the plumbing is perfectly sufficient for the remaining 80 years of their life.
I have to turn the lens inward here, just to keep us honest. Did you know the actual physiological mechanics of this before you picked up Dr. Pasricha's book? Because I absolutely did not.
Not a chance. I operated on the exact same baseline assumptions as anyone else. If it happens, great. If it doesn't, or if it hurts, just eat a bowl of bran flakes, drink a glass of water, and hope the universe sorts it out.
Right, exactly.
The idea that there's an active biomechanical technique to this, a literal right and wrong way to leverage your anatomy, was completely alien to me. I suspect you and I are unlearning decades of bad habits right alongside everyone tuning in today.
That vulnerability is exactly what makes this text so necessary. It forces you past the cultural embarrassment to look directly at the engineering.
Because if the athlete and the executive are failing due to mechanical ignorance, what is the actual blueprint? What levers are they pulling wrong?
When Dr. Pasricha breaks this down into what she calls the 3P framework.
The 3 Ps.
Yeah, these are the 3 physiological levers that dictate whether a trip to the bathroom is a seamless biological function or an agonizing ordeal. We need to unpack the mechanics of each, starting with the first P, which is propulsion.
Okay, so propulsion is the engine of the gut, driven by peristalsis. We tend to visualize the digestive tract as a passive gravity chute, just a hollow pipe.
Like if food just falls down.
Exactly. But in reality, it is a highly active muscular tube. Peristalsis is the coordinated wave-like contraction of smooth muscle that pushes contents forward.
If you picture a snake swallowing a large meal or squeezing a fresh tube of toothpaste from the very bottom all the way up to the cap, that is the rhythmic, autonomous wave of propulsion.
And the mechanism behind that wave is fascinating. It's governed by specialized cells called the interstitial cells of Kajal.
The pacemakers.
Right, they act as the electrical pacemakers of the gut, similar to how your heart has a pacemaker. When this system is healthy, it generates strong, regular waves.
But if your propulsion is weak, maybe from medication side effects, a sedentary lifestyle, or, chronic suppression like our tech executive, those pacemakers get thrown off.
The transit time slows to a crawl. The engine basically stalls out on the tracks.
And when the engine stalls, the material just sits there, which directly triggers the failure of the second P, which is pliability.
So pliability is all about the physical consistency of the stool, which is almost entirely a function of water content. We touched on this with the executive, but we need to dive deeper into the colon's job.
Yeah, the large intestine isn't just a holding tank. It's a sophisticated recycling center.
Right.
It is constantly pulling water out of the waste and absorbing it back into your bloodstream to keep you hydrated. So the longer the stool sits in the colon due to stalled propulsion, the more water gets extracted via osmosis.
The material becomes harder, drier, and vastly more difficult to move.
Exactly. And to give you a precise vocabulary to measure this pliability, Dr. Pasricha introduces the Bristol stool chart.
I mean, that chart needs to be blown up and hung in every high school health class in the country. It is the ultimate diagnostic dashboard.
It really is. It's the gold standard in gastroenterology. The Bristol stool chart categorizes human waste into 7 distinct types.
Right, so type 1 represents separate, hard lumps, like nuts.
Which means it's been sitting in the colon far too long and is severely dehydrated.
Yeah, and then type 7 is entirely liquid, meaning it moved through too fast for any water to be absorbed.
So the biological target, the Goldilocks zone you are aiming for, is type 3 or type 4. You are looking for a smooth, soft, sausage, or snake-like shape.
That chart provides the exact baseline telemetry the professor was completely ignoring for his entire life. You have to start looking at the output to understand how the machine is running.
It is the most immediate, unfiltered feedback loop your body possesses.
Yeah.
But getting the propulsion and the pliability right still leaves the final hurdle, which is the third P,
The pelvic floor.
the pelvic floor. This is where the vast majority of people are quietly sabotaging themselves.
Yeah, the pelvic floor is a highly complex hammock of muscles that sits at the base of your pelvis, right?
Mhm.
It's supporting your bladder, your bowel, your reproductive organs.
And for successful evacuation to occur, this specific group of muscles must profoundly and completely relax.
But what do most people do when they sit down and face any resistance? They instinctively bear down.
They tighten their core, they clench their jaw, and paradoxically, they tightly contract the pelvic floor. They are literally wrestling against their own anatomy.
You can trace that directly back to the elite athlete. Straining feels like you are doing work. It feels productive.
Dr. Pasricha uses an analogy here that I think perfectly clarifies the mechanical failure of straining. Imagine the pelvic floor muscles as a pair of doors on a crowded subway train. If you want to exit the train, you have to wait for the doors to slide open completely. But when most people, quote, push on the toilet, they aren't waiting for the doors to slide.
They're grabbing the doors.
They're reaching out, grabbing those subway doors, and pulling them shut with all their might. The harder you bear down, the tighter your grip on those doors becomes.
You're effectively locking yourself inside the train car while simultaneously trying to hurl your body through the glass. It is absolute mechanical madness.
The subway door analogy perfectly illustrates the trap of paradoxical contraction. You genuinely believe the physical force you are applying is solving the problem?
But that exact force is triggering the mechanism that locks the exit.
Exactly. And when you overlay that muscle confusion onto the physical geometry of the anorectal canal, you realize that the modern Western toilet is an absolute engineering catastrophe.
The physics of the toilet completely fail us. We really need to look closely at a specific muscle called the puborectalis.
Yeah, it acts like a literal sling that wraps around the rectum and attaches to your pubic bone.
When you are standing upright or sitting at a standard 90-degree angle like you do on a normal toilet, that sling is pulled incredibly tight. It pulls the rectum forward, creating a sharp 90-degree angle in the digestive tract.
A literal kink in the garden hose.
A kink designed by hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary biology to keep us continent while we're walking around hunting and gathering. It is a vital safety feature.
But when you sit on a standard porcelain toilet, your hips are only flexed at 90 degrees. You haven't changed the geometry enough.
That puborectalis sling remains partially engaged, which means the hose is still kinked.
You are trying to force solid material through a 90-degree bend in a hose while simultaneously pulling the subway doors shut. It's a miracle it works at all.
But if you change the geometry, if you shift into a full squatting position, or simply use a step stool to elevate your knees significantly above your hips, you alter the angle of hip flexion.
When your knees come up, the puborectalis sling finally goes completely slack. The anorectal angle opens up from 90 degrees to about 130 or 140 degrees. You straighten the hose.
It's just undeniable mechanical physics.
Yeah.
We are dealing with basic force vectors, torque, and leverage.
Once you unkink that anatomical hose, you allow gravity to do the majority of the work. The modern toilet prioritizes Victorian plumbing aesthetics, keeping the odors in a neat little bowl at the complete expense of human biomechanics.
And understanding those biomechanics brings us to what might be the most transformative takeaway in the entire book. You have to recalibrate your baseline expectation of what is normal. According to the physical engineering of the body, the act of pooping should take less than 1 minute, and it should require absolutely zero conscious effort.
Under a minute, zero effort. That is such a profound departure from the cultural norm.
If you are sitting there reading a magazine, if you are scrolling through social media on your phone, or if you are flexing your abdominal muscles, you are actively interfering with the process.
The system is built to work autonomously. It relies on gravity, proper geometric alignment, and relaxation.
If you are sitting there for 10, 15, or 20 minutes, you have grabbed the subway doors and you are fighting yourself.
That shift from viewing the bathroom as a combat zone to a passive, effortless release is massive.
It changes everything.
But to truly understand why the body sometimes refuses to cooperate, why the pacemakers stall, or why the subway doors lock even when we try to relax, we have to look beyond the muscles.
We have to connect the mechanical hardware of the pelvic floor to the neurological software controlling it.
Right. We have to ask, why does the gut so often seem to have a mind of its own?
Because it quite literally does.
This takes us into the second major layer of Dr. Pasricha's research, which is the brain-gut axis. We hear the phrase second brain thrown around in wellness circles constantly, right? Often as a loose metaphor for intuition.
Yeah, like trusting your gut.
Exactly. But the book clarifies that this is not poetry. It is hard anatomical science. Embedded in the lining of your gastrointestinal tract is the enteric nervous system, which contains roughly 500 million neurons.
That is more neurons than you have in your entire spinal cord.
500 million neurons operating independently inside your digestive tract.
And here's the data point that fundamentally rewrites traditional medical understanding. 90% of the communication traveling along the vagus nerve, the massive neural superhighway connecting the brain and the gut, is traveling from the gut up to the brain, not the other way around.
The implications of that are staggering. The classic biological model most of us hold is highly top-down.
Right. The brain sits up in the skull like an omnipotent CEO, surveying the body and sending orders down the chain of command. Digest this protein, contract that muscle.
But this 90% statistic proves that the gut is the one generating almost all the chatter.
If we look at this through a decentralized computing analogy, the gut is not just a dumb terminal waiting for inputs from a central mainframe.
No, the enteric nervous system is a massive, highly sophisticated local edge server. It processes incredibly complex chemical data, monitors microbiome populations, balances fluid exchange, and orchestrates the migrating motor complex all on its own.
It doesn't need to ping the brain for permission to do its job.
This is the exact reason why patients who suffer catastrophic spinal cord injuries, where the physical connection to the brain is completely severed, can still digest food and evacuate their bowels.
Because the local server is still running the base code flawlessly.
It is an autonomous intelligence network. And Dr. Pasricha proves how independent that intelligence is with the story of the FBI polygraph test.
I love this part. It's a brilliant illustration of the gut operating entirely outside our conscious control.
When a federal agent administers a lie detector test, they aren't merely tracking your sweat gland activity or your heart rate. They are closely monitoring the autonomous, involuntary reactions of your enteric nervous system.
Because when you decide to tell a lie, your conscious brain up in the skull thinks it has the narrative fully under control. You keep your face blank, you steady your voice.
But your gut, that 500 million neuron edge server, registers the physiological stress of the deception instantly. It alters its motility patterns, it dramatically shifts local blood flow, and it reacts before the conscious brain can even process the fact that the lie has been spoken.
The gut is a completely independent truth teller that bypasses the conscious filter entirely.
It cannot be manipulated by your conscious intentions. If we take that 90% bottom-up signaling statistic and map it onto a corporate structure analogy, it really crystallizes the dynamic.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a massive global manufacturing enterprise. The gut represents the frontline employees on the factory floor. They are the ones physically handling the raw materials, sensing minute shifts in the environment, and gathering critical, real-time telemetry.
And the brain inside your skull represents the C-suite executives isolated up in the boardroom.
Yes.
I see where this is going. If 90% of the memos are being sent from the factory floor up to the boardroom, those executives better be paying close attention.
Exactly the point. But look at what happens in a toxic corporate culture. The C-suite ignores the complaints from the front line. The factory workers send memos saying, hey, the machinery is overheating, the materials are contaminated, and the executives dismiss it.
Oh, they're just complaining down there. It's not a real problem. Tell them to work harder.
Ignoring chronic gastrointestinal symptoms, whether that's severe constipation, daily bloating, or sharp pain, is the biological equivalent of ignoring those frontline safety complaints.
The conscious brain writes it off as an annoyance, pushing through the workday until the entire factory floor inevitably grinds to a halt.
You end up with a full-blown systemic crisis, like chronic autoimmune disease, severe burnout, or the tech executive passing out on the tile.
Taking this mechanism seriously completely reframes our cultural understanding of anxiety. We have this pervasive, almost unshakable assumption that anxiety is strictly a top-down phenomenon.
Right. It's a feeling generated in the mind, usually triggered by external stress.
And if you get too stressed, your brain might send signals down that give you a stomach ache or nausea. The causal arrow in our culture is always pointing downward.
But the cellular biology proves the arrow is overwhelmingly pointing up. The enteric nervous system is actively reporting localized physiological distress, perhaps subtle tissue inflammation, a slight imbalance in the microbiome, or a stall in motility.
It sends those distress signals up the vagus nerve to the brain.
The brain receives this massive influx of alarm signals and interprets that physical data as the emotional state of anxiety.
So your anxious thoughts might not be the root cause of your stomach ache. Your distressed gut might be the physical generator of the neurological signals that your brain experiences as anxiety.
Which provides massive structural validation for conditions like irritable bowel syndrome. For decades, the medical establishment has treated functional gut disorders with this incredibly dismissive wave of the hand.
A patient comes in, they run the standard blood panels, they do an endoscopy, the colon looks structurally intact,
Yeah.
and the doctor says, well, the tests are clear. It's psychosomatic.
Which, in clinical practice, is basically medical code for it's all in your head, go see a therapist, and stop wasting my time.
But the reality of the enteric nervous system completely dismantles that cop-out. It isn't just in your head. It is deeply embedded in the physical hardware of your gut.
The label psychosomatic has caused incalculable damage to patients because it implies an active invention of the symptom. It implies hysteria.
Dr. Pasricha is demanding that we view the brain-gut axis as a single, indivisible physical system. You cannot artificially separate the neurological software of the mind from the biological hardware of the gut.
Exactly.
I want to hold on this point because this brings us to what I found to be the most fascinating tension in the entire book. Moving from the sheer intelligence of the gut to how the medical establishment interacts with it sparks a highly complex debate.
It does.
Dr. Pasricha makes an incredibly passionate, articulate case for the medical mandate to believe your patients. And on a human level, I agree. Doctors have gaslit patients with functional bowel disorders for a century. The dismissal is real, it's pervasive, and it destroys people's quality of life.
It leaves them entirely isolated with their pain.
It absolutely does. But, and I have to push back here, we have to scrutinize the realities of clinical practice. If we adopt this sweeping mandate to just believe the patient unconditionally, especially when every objective physical test comes back completely normal, aren't we inviting a dangerous level of clinical permissiveness?
What do you mean by permissiveness?
I mean, modern medicine is built on objective, quantifiable data for a reason. You do not want a physician to miss a slow-growing tumor or a severe inflammatory bowel disease simply because they prioritized a patient's subjective narrative over hard empirical science.
That's a fair point.
If the MRI is crystal clear, but the patient insists they're physically failing, at what point does the physician have to draw the line and trust the diagnostic data over the story?
That is the ultimate epistemological tightrope for any clinician today. How do you weigh subjective lived experience against objective clinical metrics? But I'll defend Dr. Pasricha's position here by pointing to the nuance she introduces.
Okay, let's hear the defense.
She is not advocating for an anti-science free-for-all. She isn't saying we should throw out the MRI machines, skip the blood work, or abandon colonoscopies. You must perform the gold standard testing to definitively rule out organic structural diseases, the tumors, the polyps, the physical blockages, the ulcerative colitis.
You have to clear the devastating structural threats first.
Yes. Her argument pivots on what happens after those structural tests come back normal. Historically, a clear scan was the end of the road.
The doctor washed their hands of the case.
Right, declaring the patient healthy because there was no tumor, therefore implying the suffering was a psychological fiction.
So what's the alternative?
The clinical middle ground Dr. Pasricha is fighting to establish is the recognition that a clean MRI does not mean the patient is functioning perfectly. It solely means they lack a gross anatomical defect.
Right.
They could still be suffering from a profound functional defect in the brain-gut axis, a misfiring in that 500 million neuron local server. We have to treat that axis as a legitimate system requiring dedicated neurological and physical rehabilitation, rather than using a clean scan as a weapon to label the patient a hypochondriac.
I hear the nuance, but let's test that logic against a highly specific, very common clinical scenario.
Okay.
The patient comes into the clinic and insists, with total conviction, that they are suffering from severe chronic constipation. They feel heavily backed up, physically bloated, and miserable.
It's very common.
The doctor, being thorough, orders a transit time scan. The patient swallows a specialized capsule that transmits data, tracking exactly how fast material moves through their digestive tract.
Right.
The scan results come back, and the math shows their transit time is textbook perfect. The material is moving at the exact biological speed it should. Do you still diagnose and treat them for constipation? Because objectively, structurally, and temporally, they are not constipated.
You absolutely still treat them.
But why? You are effectively treating a phantom symptom. You are treating something the data proves isn't happening.
You treat them because you have to investigate why their brain perceives constipation when the transit is physically normal. This loops us directly back to the subway doors.
How so?
Think about the sensory damage caused by decades of ignoring the biological signals, of chronic straining, of constantly locking down the pelvic floor. The nerves located in their rectal vault have likely become hypersensitive.
Oh, yeah, okay.
They are misfiring, sending agonizing distress signals up the vagus nerve to the brain, even when there is only a perfectly normal baseline amount of physical pressure.
So they don't have a propulsion problem.
No, they have a severe sensory and mechanical coordination failure. If a doctor just hands them the transit time printout, points to the normal numbers, and says, "You're fine, goodbye," they are abandoning a patient in genuine neurological agony.
So the physician's role there isn't to dismiss the physical complaint. It is to fundamentally redefine the biological goal for that patient.
Exactly. You have to explain the paradox of their own muscles, refer them to pelvic floor physical therapy, and help them recalibrate their internal sensors.
You validate the reality of their suffering, but you redirect the medical intervention from giving you laxatives to make the gut move faster, to retraining your nervous system how to accurately interpret pressure and letting the muscles open.
Right.
When you frame it as a sensory misfire rather than a phantom symptom, the mandate to believe them makes complete sense. You aren't validating a false physical reality, you are validating a broken neural pathway.
Yes, beautifully said.
But that reframing leads directly to another concept in the text that I really struggled with, Dr. Pasricha's notion of puphoria.
The pursuit of the elusive perfect movement.
Exactly. She describes this state of physiological bliss, this puphoria that occurs when the vagus nerve is stimulated in the exact perfect way during a completely effortless evacuation.
Right.
The stimulation drops your resting heart rate, lowers your blood pressure, and floods your system with a tangible sense of well-being. It sounds incredible on paper, but practically speaking,
You think it's too much pressure.
by elevating this transcendent state as the new biological standard, aren't we just injecting a massive dose of performance anxiety into the process? It is hard enough for the 40% of adults suffering to just get the basic mechanics right.
That's true.
Now they're going to be sitting on the toilet, analyzing their heart rate, stressing out because they didn't achieve neurological nirvana. It feels like we are adding immense psychological pressure to an act we just established needs zero conscious effort.
That is a highly valid critique. I mean, if you internalize dysphoria as a rigid daily metric, a biological KPI you have to hit every single morning, then yes, it will absolutely induce performance anxiety and lock the subway doors tighter.
Exactly my concern.
But I interpreted her inclusion of that concept very differently. I think the idea of puphoria is strategically vital because it radically shifts the psychological mindset of the chronic sufferer.
How so?
Consider the mental state of someone dealing with this dysfunction for 20 years. They view their own bathroom as a torture chamber. They view their digestive tract as a fundamentally broken, hostile entity that they have to wage war against every single day.
It is a mindset of pure biological combat.
Precisely. When Dr. Pasricha introduces the physiological reality of puphoria, she completely flips that narrative. It takes the patient from, "I have an incurable, agonizing bodily defect," to, "My physical hardware is actually designed by evolution to make this process feel incredibly good. I just have a learned mechanical habit that is currently blocking it."
It shifts the locus of control back to the patient.
It restores their sense of physical agency. It tells them they aren't irreparably broken. Their software just requires a patch.
Offering the scientific proof that the system is built for harmony rather than pain is a profoundly necessary psychological reset for anyone who has suffered in the dark for that long.
It changes the entire destination of the journey from mere survival to actual harmony. I can see why that dramatic reframing is required, particularly given how thoroughly our modern culture has eroded our relationship with this baseline function.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of application. When you encounter a text that fundamentally disrupts your understanding of your own daily biology, you cannot simply close the cover and go back to your old routines.
The theoretical neuroscience and the force vectors of the pelvic floor are fascinating to discuss, but the practical application is the only thing that actually heals the dysfunction. What did this change for you?
For me, it forced a highly uncomfortable audit of my entire morning routine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I realized as I was reading the breakdown of the brain-gut axis that I have historically treated my time in the bathroom as an irritating, low-value task that needed to be rushed through so I could start my real day.
Right, checking it off the list.
And my primary coping mechanism for the perceived boredom of sitting there, my smartphone. I am constantly scrolling feeds, checking overnight emails, reading stressful news headlines.
You are dragging the chaos of the outside world directly into the one place that requires autonomic relaxation.
I am completely severing the mind-muscle connection. My conscious brain is locked in a state of sympathetic stress over an email from my boss, while my autonomic nervous system is simultaneously trying to coordinate the deeply complex muscular release of the puborectalis sling.
It is a guaranteed recipe for mechanical failure.
So my actionable change is strict adherence to the 5-minute rule. If the process does not happen smoothly and effortlessly within 5 minutes, I am standing up, walking away, and resetting.
I love that.
No more forcing it. Furthermore, the smartphone is permanently banned. I am leaving all screens in the other room.
That's a huge step.
And most importantly, I am immediately purchasing a squat stool. After understanding the undeniable physics of the anorectal angle and the kink in the hose, sitting on a standard Western toilet feels like an act of deliberate self-sabotage.
It really does.
My pelvic floor needs to be protected, and the geometry is just too clear to ignore.
It truly is amazing how a slight alteration in your physical geometry can resolve decades of anatomical friction. For me, the major takeaway was actually less mechanical and far more interpersonal.
Oh.
Yeah, the debate we had about the mandate to believe your patients triggered a deeply personal memory. As I was reading her defense of the functional gut, I immediately thought of one of my closest friends.
What happened with your friend?
For years, she suffered from chronic, truly agonizing bloating. She would eat a basic small meal, and within an hour, her abdomen would distend so severely she looked 6 months pregnant.
The physical discomfort of that, not to mention the psychological toll, must have been overwhelming.
It dominated her life, and the medical runaround she was subjected to was absolutely infuriating. She went to 5 different gastroenterologists, 5,
Wow.
and every single one of them ran the standard blood panels. They did a baseline scan, and when everything looked structurally normal, they sat her down in the office and told her that her chronic bloating was just a physical manifestation of her generalized anxiety.
You're kidding.
No, they told her she was too stressed at work. They told her to try mindfulness meditation, maybe do some yoga, and eat more probiotic yogurt.
The classic textbook psychosomatic dismissal.
Completely. They convinced her the pain was generated by her own inability to manage stress. She genuinely started to believe she was losing her mind.
Did she ever get an actual answer?
Finally, the 6th doctor she saw took a different approach. They didn't dismiss the physical symptom just because the colon looked clear. They understood the complexity of the brain-gut axis, they recognized that the local edge server might be compromised, and they ordered a specialized breath test for SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth.
Wait, how does a breath test diagnose a gut issue? That seems mechanically disconnected.
It's actually a brilliant piece of diagnostic engineering. The small intestine is supposed to be relatively sterile. Its job is to absorb nutrients.
Right.
The large intestine is where the massive colonies of bacteria live to ferment waste. But if your motility slows down or a valve malfunctions, the bacteria from the large intestine creep up into the small intestine.
Ah, so they're in the wrong place.
Exactly. They start fermenting the food you eat before you can absorb it.
Hmm.
When those invasive bacteria ferment carbohydrates, they produce massive amounts of hydrogen and methane gas.
Humans do not naturally produce those gases.
Right. But those gases dissolve into your bloodstream, travel up to your lungs, and are exhaled in your breath. The breath test detects the chemical exhaust of the invasive bacteria.
That is incredible.
Right.
So the test bypasses the subjective feeling entirely and measures the exact chemical byproduct of the dysfunction. And what did her test show?
It showed a massive, raging bacterial overgrowth in her small intestine. The local server was literally infected.
So it wasn't anxiety.
It wasn't anxiety, it wasn't stress, it wasn't in her head. It was a tangible biological pathogen hijacking her digestive tract that required a highly specific, targeted course of antibiotics to eradicate.
And when she took them?
Once the physical bacteria were treated, the bloating vanished completely. The supposed anxiety vanished. It was a complete cure through antibiotics, not through mindfulness therapy.
That perfectly illustrates the exact danger of the clinical blind spot we were debating. The dismissal by the first 5 doctors almost cost her years of her life, simply because they lacked the framework to investigate beyond the structural scans.
Exactly, which is why my actionable change from reading this text dictates how I communicate with the people in my own life. When friends or family members mention chronic gut issues, I am stopping the amateur, culturally accepted advice.
Right, no more just telling them to drink water.
I am no longer going to offer platitudes like, oh, you should just eat more fiber, because as we've learned from the mechanics of the pelvic floor, if someone is paradoxically contracting their muscles, throwing more bulk fiber at a tightly locked subway door is only going to create a much more painful traffic jam.
That is such a vital distinction. Fiber is not a universal magic wand if the exit pathway is barricaded. It just adds mass to the blockage.
Right. So instead of dispensing uninformed advice, I'm going to ask better, more incisive questions. I'm going to ask, have you looked at the Bristol stool chart? Are you aware of the pelvic floor dynamics?
That's amazing.
I want to help normalize this conversation in my own circles so that no one else has to drag themselves to 5 different doctors just to prove that their physical pain is real. We have to become highly educated advocates for our own biomechanics.
And that advocacy circles us right back to the exact place we started. Think again about that university professor who had never once looked at his own biological output.
After spending an hour exhaustively unpacking the 3P mechanics, the force vectors, and the 500 million neurons of the brain-gut axis, we finally understand that his ignorance wasn't a marker of stupidity.
No.
It wasn't a lack of intellectual curiosity. It was the result of a culture that had taught him, systematically from the age of 2, that this specific vital part of his body was fundamentally unworthy of his attention.
We train people to achieve, to optimize, to perform in the boardroom and on the field,
Sure.
while simultaneously demanding they completely divorce themselves from the biological reality that physically sustains them.
Maybe the most radical, rebellious thing you can do for your long-term health is to simply start paying attention to the one biological act you perform every single day, and finally give it the respect and the mechanical understanding it deserves.
That's it for this episode of Deep Into the Pages. We've been talking about You've Been Pooping All Wrong by Dr. Trisha Pasricha. Next time you sit down, and you will remember, it's not a wrestling match, it's a conversation. And your gut is the one doing most of the talking.